Today we're going to start a new quilt series. There will be a total of 8 different blocks. You're going to make 2 of each block. I'm making it a square quilt to throw over the back of my couch, but you can make it any size that you would like. The blocks are 12 inches, and it will go over the next couple of video updates. I'm going to try to do at least 1 to 2 blocks per video, and then we will do an assembly. If you want to see the whole playlist, if you're watching this after the series is complete, I'll have it linked in the description below, and I will also have a full video from start to finish of the whole quilt. Hello and welcome. I am Jackie with Jackie Russell Creates, where we talk about everything quilting. I give tips, tricks, and techniques for your next quilting project. So let's learn how to make some scrappy ornaments for our quilt. But the material that you're going to need for this project, and I'll list it in the description below, you're going to need about 16 fat quarters or a bunch of scrap fabric. I just went and found my Christmas fabric, and we're just using what I have. You're going to need about a fat 1/8 of some gray or silver. I just took a strip from a jelly roll that I had, and that's what I'm using. And you're going to need roughly 2.5 yards of your background fabric. I'm using a bright white. Then you're going to need about 1.5 yards for your sashing. Now, because I'm making mine smaller, I only needed 1 yard, so it just depends on the size that you are creating. So if you're new here and you feel like sticking around and learning more about quilting, hit that subscribe button, and let's get started making some scrappy ornament blocks. This is the other one we will be doing today. So for our very first block, you're going to need 2 strips that are 2.5 by 8.5. You're going to need 2 strips that are 1.25 by 8.5. You're going to need 1 strip that's 3 by 8.5. You're going to need, from your gray strip, 1.5 by 2.5. From your background fabric, you're going to need a 1.5 by 3.5, and you're going to need 2 of those. You're going to need 4 2.5-inch squares. You're going to need a 2.5 by 8.5. You're also going to need a 1.5 by 8.5, and then you're going to need 2 that are 2.5 by 12.5. Now, to get started, I like to work in as much strips or pieces as I can. So I'm going to start by piecing the strips together. So I'm going to take a 1.5 by 3.5 and sew it to the gray. And then I'm going to take 2.5 or 1.25 to the 2.5. And I'm just going to piece them together. And I'm a pinner. If you haven't noticed by following my channel, I like to pin my stuff. It just keeps things together while I'm sewing. I am using multiple styles of fabric. I have from 100% cotton, I have flannel, I have poly cotton, that is all being used in this quilt. So feel free to mix and match and add whatever type of fabric that you would like. So we're going to sew these together. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam, just a straight stitch. I have my 1/4 inch foot. Now I'm just going to take the other 1.5 by 3.5 and sew to the gray. I'm just finger pressing this open for right now. I will go and iron them or press them all when I'm done. I'm just taking the other red strip and putting it on. And this should come out to an 8.5 inch square. We're going to take it to the ironing board and we're going to press it and press it to the darker fabrics, or which way the fabric would like to go. And for this one with the gray, I'm going to press both of them in toward the gray. Now we're going to take our 1.5 inch white and attach it to the one with the gray. And now we're going to take our 2 1/4 or 2.5 inch squares, and we're going to draw a line from corner to corner on all 4. And this is going to be our snowball effect. And now we're going to place them on our red, and they're going to overlap down into the other strip, but you want to make sure that your line is not at the corner of them, it's going the other direction. And you're going to sew directly on that line on all 4 squares. So there you can see where I stitched right on that line, and I'm going to do that for the other 3. Now this is what it looks like. And you're going to, I like to make sure that I sewed it the right direction just to be safe. I've done it backwards before. If they all fold out like they're supposed to, now you're going to cut a 1/4 inch. So I put my 1/4 inch on that line I just sewed and trim it off. Now I don't throw these away. I do keep these. This would be perfect for a half square triangle. So you're going to take it now to the ironing board and just press these out. And once you press it out, they still should be an 8.5 square. And then we're also going to take and press this toward the top where there's less bulk. Well, what I like to do is fold the gray in half and just finger press just so I can get a marking where the center is. And I like to do the same thing with this square just so I know where the center is, so that way I can line the center of the block with the center of the ornament hook top, and it's even. So I line up those creases and put a pin. Yes, it should line up if you just sewed it across, but I like to, you don't have that extra security of knowing that it's in the center spot. Then we're going to attach the 2.5 white onto the bottom, and then we're going to press it toward the white. I know you should press it toward the dark, but I like to press where there's less bulk. You can press it either way you prefer. At this point, there's no seams that have to match up, so you can press it whichever direction you would like. At this time, this is now 12.5 by 8.5. We're just going to add our side pieces, and that will give us our block. And there is our first block, and we have 2 of them made now. This is another simple block. It is just a patchwork. So you're going to need the same measurements, which I will list them down in the description below, for the gray and your white. To do your patchwork, you're going to need 16 2.5-inch squares. And I just took some scrap jelly rolls that I had and cut them up. And then you just want to kind of lay this out. You don't want the same, it's patchwork, so you just want to lay it out so things are different. So I just laid it so I had different fabric in each row and column. Once I have it laid out, I'm going to stitch using the chain stitch just like this. I'm going to sew these together, then I'll sew these ones on, and then sew these ones on. I do not cut my thread in between. And since I went down the row or the column, I can just open these up and attach the other one without cutting the threads in between here, and it will help keep everything together. Now I'm just going to add the last one on each of them. And now that they're still attached, I can go in and press them, and I'm going to press one toward the left, one toward the right, the next one to the left, the next one to the right. I'm not going to cut these threads just yet. So you can see where I press these to the left, them to the right, them to the left, them to the right. So then I'm just going to fold these over, and now they're going to nestle up among themselves, and it's going to make it so much easier. If that little thread gets in your way, you can cut it now if you want, but I like to pin at each seam. That just helps keep them nestled together as I'm sewing. And then I'm going to flip up the bottom one so then I can sew one right after the other. And like I said, because we pressed in opposite directions, those seams should just nestle real nice up together. And then once I have these two sewn, I'll just open them up and stitch that last seam. So there is the Scrappy or Patchwork center of the block. It should measure 8.5 by 8.5. And now we're going to start assembling it. We're going to take our gray. We're going to take the gray and attach it to the 1.5 by 3.5 like we did in the previous one. We're going to take our squares and draw our line from corner to corner. So what is one of your favorite Christmas ornaments that you have that you put on your tree every year? Comment below and let me know. I have several. I have some that my mother made for us. I have some that I had when I was growing up. But every year we make new ornaments with the kids to go on our tree. So comment below and let me know what your favorite Christmas ornament is for your tree. And then we're just going to line these corners up and stitch along those lines. So because I have my 1/4 inch foot, it has a hole where the needle goes down, and then it's a space so I can see where my line is going in, and so I just line that up and follow it straight down, making sure that my line is in that groove. Now we're going to just line the 1/4 inch up on that stitch line, and once again save those triangles. You can go ahead and stitch them now if you'd like, and already have them sewn together. So now we're just going to take it to the ironing board and press it open and press this toward the gray. This should still measure 8.5 by 8.5. And now we're going to finish assembling this block. We're going to put the 2.5 along the bottom, and I'm going to go ahead and sew these two together. So because we know that this is our center point, I'm just going to fold the gray in half and give it just a little finger press so I can line that crease up with that center seam, because I know that's the center, and go stitch that, and then iron or press everything to whatever direction you feel is comfortable. I let the fabric tell me which direction it wants to go. And now it's just finishing the block by putting our 12.5 inch along the edge. And there is our second block. So for our first block, I had a panel that was left over from another quilt that I made, and it had these cardinals on it. And so I just cut them 8.5 by 6.5. And then I'm just taking some jelly rolls, and I picked the brown because it helped pull out the gold outline in the picture. And so I'm just going to lay and stitch these side pieces on, and then I'm going to cut this at a 8.5 inch square. All the dimensions will be in the description below, so enjoy watching the video and you'll be able to get the cut dimensions down there. Then you're also going to need 4 squares that are 2.5 inches square. You're going to need a gray. I just took a jelly roll strip and cut it down. It is 2.5 by 1.5, and then you need 2 strips that are 1.5 by 3.5. You're going to need another strip that's 1.5 by 8.5, and then a strip that's 2.5 by 8.5, and then 2 strips that are 12.5 by 2.5. I like to work in strips, so I'm going to pin the 10 strips to my cardinal, but I'm also going to go ahead and start stitching this gray piece to the sides. So I'm just going to pin this on each side, right sides together. You don't have to pin, but I like to pin. It just actually holds things better for me. So here we have our gray strip with the white sewn on both sides at 1/4 inch. We're going to go to the ironing board and we're going to press those toward the gray. And then here is our cardinal, and we're going to press these toward the brown or the tan. And then we're going to come back and cut this. Now we're going to trim this up to 8.5. So there is our block that is now 8.5 inch square. And then we have our gray strip. We're just going to sew the 1.5 by 8.5 to the one with the gray. Then we're going to take our squares, our 2.5 inch squares, and I'm just using a friction pin, and we're going to draw a line from corner to corner on all 4 of them. If you missed the first video, you can find it in the description below, but you can also find it right here if you want to go see the first 2 blocks that we made in this series of our vintage ornament quilt. There will also be a playlist listed down in the description. So for this, we're going to line up on the edge, and then we're just going to sew right down that line on all 4 corners. So when you're placing your squares on, you want to make sure that you're not stitching from this top corner of your background. You want to make sure that you're stitching at the diagonal there. Okay, so here we have our 4 corners on, and you're just going to cut 1/4 of an inch. So I put my 1/4 of an inch line on the stitching, and then I save these corner or triangles, and I can stitch them together and have a half square triangle. Or you can save them for other projects if you just need applique or something. These blocks would be great made into some cute little Christmas pillows, some wall hangings. And now we're just going to go to the ironing board and we're going to press them open, and it should come out to 8.5 inch square. So there's our square block. There is our top. So we're going to take our 2.5 by 8.5 and attach to the bottom. But first I'm going to fold the gray in half and give it a little finger press. And I'm going to fold the cardinal in half and give it a finger press as well. That just helps me find the center. So then I can lay both the creases together and know that my top is center with the rest of my block. And we're just going to pin that, and then we're going to sew it down at 1/4 of an inch, and then we're going to sew this bottom down as well, and then we're going to iron it or press it toward the white, and then we'll be back to finish up the block. Now we're going to take our 12.5 inch strips and attach them down the side. Then I will press toward the white, and there is our first block. This is actually block number 3. So now let's do block number 4. Block number 4 is called stripes, diagonal stripes, and we're making half square triangles. So the white fabric is all the same measurements, same with the gray as before. I'll link them down in the description. For the red pieces, they are going to be cut at 2.5 by 8.5, and each of our half square triangles, or the squares for our triangles, are going to be cut at 3 inch square. So I have the 2 different color of fabrics, and there's 1 or 2 ways that you can do it of marking it. You'll need a total of 4 of each color of fabric. You can draw a line from corner to corner, but instead of sewing on this line, you're going to sew 1/4 inch on each side. Or if you have the June Taylor half square triangle ruler, you can take this side, which says mark stitching lines. You line up the black line corner to corner, and then you just draw your line in those slits, and now that's going to give you your stitch marks. So either way will work, whatever tool you have to get the job done. Like I said, we're just making half square triangles. So now we're just going to put right sides together, and we're going to stitch down the lines, unless you did it with just a single line, and then you'll do the 1/4 inch on both sides. So this is the one that I have the line from corner to corner. I have my 1/4 inch presser foot on, and so I'm just lining that line up with the edge of my presser foot and going straight down. So I just cut them in half and press them toward the green section. Now we need to square these up to 2.5 inch squares. I like to use my June Taylor ruler. It just makes it so much easier to line up and trim. So you put your line, your 45-degree on your seam, and then because we need these at 2.5 inches, we're going to just slide right in the 2.5 groove and cut off. Then you're just going to rotate, line up that 45 again, and match up your 2.5 on your top and bottom, and then trim off. So you're going to do that with all 8 blocks. Now there are other tools out there. Feel free to use those. However it's easier for you to square up your half square triangles. Use whatever tool you have. There's so many ways to be able to do it that no one way is the right way or the better way. It's whatever works for you and the equipment and tools that you have. Now that you have them all cut to 2.5 inch square, now you just need to lay them out so you can get that diagonal design. And then I'm just going to sew these 2 pieces together like this, and I'm going to keep them chained, and then I'll open it up and sew this piece to this until I have them all sewn together. So I have them sewn together, and what I did is I pressed one toward the right and one toward the left. So then when we flip them over, the seams are going to nest right up together. You can also press them open if you want, but this way they nest up there together nicely. And then before I take this to the ironing board again, I'm going to sew on the red strips on each end, which will give me an 8.5 inch square. Now that we have our diagonal stripe finished, I pressed toward the red, and then for the center one I pressed open. That just kind of helps flatten out that bulk right there. Next we're going to take our 2.5 inch white. We're going to draw a line down the center, corner to corner, on all 4 of them. If you're good at eyeballing and showing a straight line, you could just sew corner to corner. You could also just crease, fold it in half, and then follow that crease line. I just like to have a visual, something more visual to see. So we're going to stitch these on each corner. Then we're going to also take our 1.5 by 3.5 inch strips, and we're going to sew on each side of our gray 1.5 by 2.5 inch strip. So now that we have our corners sewed on, I'm just going to cut the 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can save these little triangles. We're going to take these to the ironing board, and we're going to press them open to the white, and you'll should have a 8.5 inch square block when we're done. And I'm going to take and press this one, which has the gray in the center. We're going to press toward the gray. Now I'm going to take my 1.5 by 8.5 and sew that to the strip with the gray. And then I'm going to take my 2.5 by 8.5 and sew it to the bottom of the ornament. Now what I'm going to do is fold this in half at the top and give it a little finger press so I can just make a little crease. I'm going to do the same thing with the gray, and that's just so I can make sure that my top is center with my ornament. So I'm just going to line up those two creases, right sides together, and sew that top on. Then you're going to go and press the seams, and then we'll be here to finish up our block. Now all we have left to do is attach our 12.5 by 2.5 to each side. And there is our second or fourth block. So we're going to work on the star block today, or first, and you're going to need a pattern block, and I cut it at 4.5 by 4.5. You're going to need 3-inch squares of a pattern and of your star color. I chose white. You're also going to need 4 2.5-inch of your color fabric. That's going to be in the corners. You're also going to need 4 white or your background fabric at 2.5. You're going to need a gray that is 1.5 by 2.5, and then some white that is 1.5 by 3.5. Another white that's 1.5 by 8.5. A 2.5 by 8.5, and then you're going to need 2 12.5 by 8.5. So to get started, we're just going to put the whites mainly off to the side. We're going to start with our 3-inch blocks, and we're going to make them as half square triangles. You can take your ruler, and we're going to draw a line from corner to corner. Then what we're going to do is we're going to put right sides together, and we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and you're going to sew 1/4 inch on each side of that line. And because I like to work in stages, I guess, as much as I can, so when I'm at the sewing machine, I'm also going to sew the 1.5-inch white to the gray on both sides. And because I have the 1/4 foot on, I can just line up my line that I drew along the edge of my presser foot, and it will give me that 1/4 inch. And this is how it comes off the sewing machine, because I did the chain stitch. So I'm just going to snip those threads in between, and then we're just going to take our ruler and we're going to cut on those lines that we drew. And now there's our half square triangles. We're going to take it to the ironing board, and we're going to press, and we're going to press this one toward the gray. Now that we have them all pressed, we need to square them up, and they need to be squared at the 2.5 inch. So I like to use my June Taylor ruler, and it's so simple to use. You just mark up your 45, and you line up your 2.5, and then cut down the 2.5 inch marks. Then all you do is flip it around and do the other sides, and it gives you a perfect 2.5 inch square. Half square triangle. So I'm going to cut the rest of these up, and then we'll be back to assemble the block. Now what I like to do is lay out my block so I know, what I need to sew as my strips. So we're going to take our 2.5 of the green, we're going to put 1 in each corner, and then we're going to lay out our star pieces so we know which way to sew the green fabric. So you pretty much want your stars or your white pieces to come into the corners to give you that star. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the 2 center ones together, and then sew these, the top and the bottom rows together, and then we're going to sew the 2 side pieces onto our 4.5 square, and then we'll sew each row together. And then I'm going to also take the 1.5 by 8.5 white and sew it together using the chain stitch. So there's the first 2 of the top row here, and so I'm just going to flip this one over and sew onto there. So there is the first side of the middle row, so I'm going to sew that to my design, and then sew that
piece over to that. So here is our rows sewn together. We're going to go to the ironing board and we're going to press rows 1 and 3 to the left and the center one to the right. And then you're going to sew the strips together. So because we press these the opposite direction, they should nestle up to give you that clean corner. And I'm going to pin to make sure they stay in place. And I'm going to go ahead and pin both sections together, or all 3 rows, so then I can just flip it over to just stitch the whole thing together, and then you'll just take it to the ironing board and press it. And when you're done pressing, this square should be an 8.5, and there is the center of our block. Now we're going to do the snowball effect to give our corners. So we're going to take our 2.5-inch squares of our white, and we're going to draw a line down the middle of it, corner to corner. But this time, instead of stitching on both sides of the line, we're going to actually stitch right down that line. All I'm doing is using a friction pin. They are my favorite tool to use. You can use whatever works for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay them, we're going to line up the corner, making sure our stitch line is going diagonal, and we're going to stitch all 4 of these on, one on each corner, going diagonal, right on that line. So here we have them all stitched on, and I like to make sure that I have them stitched the right direction. Yes, I have stitched them on backwards before. So if they're going the right directions as you open it up, we're going to now cut those off. I line up my 1/4 inch on my ruler onto that stitch line and trim it off. I don't throw away these triangles. They make good half square triangles for future projects or for some sashing or even corner pieces if you want to do a border. And now we're just going to go press them toward the white section. This should measure 8.5 by 8.5. You can trim it up if you need to. Now we're going to finish the block. What I like to do is take the piece that has the gray, and I like to fold it in half and just kind of finger press that down. Just give a little crease. Because we have this seam here in the middle, we know that that's going to be the center. And so I'm going to line that crease that I made on the green up with that seam. That way I know my ornament top is center. It should be center when you stitch this on, but I like to have that extra security. So we're going to just stitch this on, and then we're going to take the 2.5 by 8.5 white fabric, and we're going to sew that, not glue it, we're going to sew that onto the bottom. We're going to press this open, and then we're going to come back and stitch on our 12.5 strips. Now, to finish up the block, we're just going to add our 12.5-inch strips to each side. And there is our 5th ornament block. And so now let's start with this is a checkered block. You're going to need the same measurements for all our white pieces. I will link them all down in the description below. You're going to need the 1.5 by 2.5 gray. Then you're going to need 4 pieces from 2 different types of fabric that are 2.5-inch squares. Then you're going to need 2 that are 2.5 by 8.5-inch squares. So what I did is I had a jelly roll, and I fussy cut to make sure I had the bird and the gnome that says gnome for the holidays. And that's what I'm using for my checkered. This one's pretty simple. You just sew every other fabric together. So you have 4 pieces of 2, and then you'll sew them together so you have 4 and 4. And then you're going to press one to the right and one to the left. So I also sewed the 1.5 by 3.5 to the gray, and I pressed toward the gray. Now we're going to take our 2 strips, and because we press them in opposite directions, they're actually going to nestle up against each other, making a nice corner there. So we're going to sew those together. I am pinning. I like to pin at each seam. That just helps keep it together as I'm stitching. Then I'm going to take the 1.5 by 8.5 and I'm going to stitch that to the gray. We're going to press to the white, and then on the checkered you can press open or you can press whichever way is less bulk, which way the fabric wants to go. Now we're going to add our 2.5 by 8.5 onto the top and the bottom of our checkered. We're going to sew it at 1/4 inch and we're going to press it toward the solid strip. And when we come back, we are going to do the snowball effect. Now we're going to do the snowball effect. We're going to take our 2.5 squares of our white and we're going to draw a line. I'm just using a friction pen from corner to corner. Then we're going to sew right on that line. What we're going to do is we're going to line up the corners, making sure our line is going diagonal, and you're going to stitch along that line on all 4 corners. Okay, so we have them all sewn on. I like to double check, make sure that they are, when they open up, they go the right direction. Now we're going to take, and I just line up my 1/4 inch line on my ruler with the stitch line and cut off the extra. I save these triangles to make half square triangles with, or to use in my applique. Now we're going to go press these toward the white. There's the center of our block. Now all we need to do is finish it. So what I like to do is fold this in half at the top and give me a little finger press so I have a crease there. And I'm going to do the same thing with the gray. And this just helps to ensure that your top is center with your ornament. So now I'm going to take that crease and line it up with that crease, and we're going to pin it. Then we're going to take the 2.5 by 8.5 and we're going to stitch it to the bottom. Then we're going to press toward the white and then toward the striped fabric, or however your fabric wants to go at the top, whichever way gives you less bulk. Then we'll come back and finish up our block. Now to finish up the block, all we're going to do is sew on our 12.5 inch strips to each side.
So our first block is our pinwheel block, and you're going to need 2 5-inch squares from 2 different colors of fabric. I'm using a holly and a red. You're going to need 4 2.5-inch squares of your background fabric, which I'm using white, a 2.5 by 8.5, 2 that are 12.5 by 2.5. You're going to need 1 that is 1.5 by 8.5, 2 that are 1.5 by 3.5, and a gray or a silver that is 1.5 by 2.5. I will have all these measurements linked down below, so you will have them. So we're going to start with fabrics 1 and 2, which is the 5-inch squares. And we're going to draw a line from corner to corner on the back of 2 of them. We're pretty much making half square triangles. And so you're going to sew 1/4 inch on each side of that line. So you're going to put right sides together and you're going to sew on both sides. You're also going to take your gray strip with the 2 that are 3.5 inch long, and we're going to sew one of them on each side of the gray. And I like to do the chain piecing. We're going to take our ruler and we're going to cut down that line that we drew. Then we're going to take to the ironing board and we're going to press them open, and I'm going to press them all toward the green, and then we're going to press the gray in toward the gray. And Sugar May came to help us today. How you doing, baby girl? Now we're going to take, and I like to use my June Taylor ruler, and we're going to square these up to 4.5. And now that they're all squared up, we just need to lay them in a pinwheel pattern, and you're going to sew the two together and make 2 rows. And then you're going to take your 8.5-inch strip, that's 1.5, and sew it to the one with the gray. So I sewed those together, and then I pressed them toward the green fabric on both of them, and then that way they'll be able to nest together. And so now we're just going to sew the 2 rows together, and because we press toward the green, you're going to get a nice nestle right there so you don't clip those corners. And then you can press it open, or however you prefer to press it, so you have less bulk right there in that center joint. Now that we have that all sewn together, we're going to do the snowball effect. So you need to take your 4 2.5-inch squares, and you're going to draw a line from corner to corner, and this time we're going to sew right along that line. We're going to place them on the corner of all 4 corners, and then we're going to sew right along on that line. Now I like to check to make sure that I sewn them on right, and if I have, then I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to line my 1/4-inch mark on that stitch line, and we're going to cut off those little triangles. Be sure to save your triangles. Then we're going to take this to the ironing board and press them open. Now we're going to attach the hanging part. I like to fold the gray in half and give it a little finger press. And because I know that this seam is in the center, I can just line up that little crease right along that edge, that seam. And that's going to assure that the hanger is in the center of our block. Then we're also going to sew the 2.5 by 8.5 along the bottom of this block. So let me know what your favorite block is so far out of all 8 blocks that we have completed. You can be able to watch a playlist that I'll have listed in the description below, but I also will have it up in the right hand corner coming up on the screen. So let me know which one is your favorite so far. Now we're just going to finish up the block by putting the 12.5-inch strips along the side. And now you just press everything nice and flat. And there is block number 7. Now let's move on to our last block, which is a square in a square. And you're going to need the same measurements for the top and the sides. But for your squares, you're going to need to cut your center block at 8.5 square. And then you're going to cut your side pieces at 4 3/4. Then you're going to take your ruler and you're going to draw a line from corner to corner. Now if you're doing a directional, make sure that you have it lined up so it folds out good. And then we're going to take our block. We're going to do it kind of like we did the snowball effect on the other blocks, but you're going to do opposite corners. So you're going to start at one corner and then do the opposite, just like that, and you're going to stitch right on that line. Now before we add the other 2 corners on, we need to trim this. So you're going to leave a 1/4-inch seam allowance. Then you're going to press these open, and you're going to press toward the center block. Now all we did was the same thing. We just added the other 2 corners and then press toward the center block. Now we're going to do the snowball effect. So we're going to take our 2.5-inch squares. We're going to draw a line
from corner to corner on all 4 of them, or you can eyeball it if you are brave enough. And you're going to take and you're going to sew these kind of the same way. You're just going to sew on that corner, but you can go all the way around and just sew on that line. Then I'm also going to take the gray or the silver, and I'm going to sew the 1.5 by 3.5 on each side to give us the hanger. Now we have the corner pieces sewn on. We need to check to make sure they're going the right direction, but we're going to trim them off, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then you're going to take it to the ironing board and press toward the white. You're also going to take your strip with the gray, and you're going to press toward the gray. Now we just got to decide which way we want our block to go, and you're going to take the 2.5 by 8.5 and put it at the bottom, and you're going to take the 1.5 by 8.5 and sew it to the gray strip. Now we're going to attach the hanger, and what I'm going to do is take and fold the gray in half, give it a finger press, and I'm going to do the same thing with the block just to make sure that, you know, it's lining up perfect. We're going to sew on that to the top of the block. We're going to take it to the ironing board and press everything toward the white. Now let's finish this block up by adding the 2 strips down the side. So this first one is very scrappy. All I did was take a bunch of the scraps that I used for my quilt top, and we're just going to sew them together. I will have the cut description down in the description below so that you can be able to cut your pieces for the quilt or the block. So what I did is I just have a bunch of scrap pieces here that's left over from the other block, and I'm just going to sew them together and then cut them and piece them together. So really what I'm doing is just taking some scraps. So like here's just a small one. We'll just sew it right down this edge, and you need them to be an 8.5 inch square by the time you're done piecing. So I know this brown tan piece here is 8.5 inches. So I'm going to use that as my guide to make sure that the rest are going to come along that same width. And I'm not caring if they match up or not, because I will can cut those pieces off. Let's see, what else can we, okay, so we'll just take and sew this piece onto the top of these 2 pieces. You can press in between if you'd like. I just finger press. If you don't want your 2.5 inch strips to be 2.5, you want them to be smaller, you can, you know, cut them down. So we'll just sew this piece onto the other side, and you just keep sewing on little pieces here and there that you have. So I'll just line this one up and sew it, and then we'll just trim it up along this edge. I'm not being too precise, just trimming off the extra. And now we have this little piece that we can use. We are about 6.5 inches. So we'll just take one of these and just cut a strip, and then we'll attach that to this side, and then I'll trim this edge off. So now we'll attach our brown or tan to the top. You could even make this a crumb and use a bunch of just your little pieces. Let's see, and now it's about 4.5 inches. So we'll add a reindeer across the bottom here. So once it's all together, I'll give it a good press and square it all up. We're going to add our snowflake to this edge just to give it a little more length. and sew it across the bottom. We'll roughly see where that measures. Okay, we're going to go give it a good pressing because it measures around 9 inches all the way around. So we're going to go give it a good pressing, and then we'll come back and square it up. Now I gave it a good press, and now we're just going to measure it to 8.5 and trim it all up square. So there we have an 8.5-inch square. Now you're going to take some white, and you're going to need 2 that is 4.5 square, and then 2 that are 2.5-inch square. And we're just doing the snowball effect that we did on the other blocks. You can see those. I'll have a link up in the description and down up here in the right hand corner. And we're just going to draw a line from corner to corner. High sugar May on all 4 of the pieces. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take the 4.5 and we're going to place it at the bottom. You're only going to do 1 at a time on the bottom. So we're going to sew this one, and then I'm going to go ahead and sew the 2 small ones on. Then I'm going to take the 1.5 by 2.5 gray and sew it to the 1.5 by 3.5. I'm going to sew 1 on each side. You're going to help Mom today. Okay, so we have those 3 corners sewed on. And what we're going to do now is at least cut a 1/4 inch off of the big square, and then we're going to press it open. So we're going to go ahead and go press this. So then when we put this other one on, it will overlap onto this edge so that it will give us our point at the bottom of our ornament. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these other ones off, and then I can be able to press them all open. And then I'm also going to take this strip and press toward either the silver or the gray, whatever you're using for the top. So now that we have those ones pressed open, we're going to take and line this one up along that edge, and we're going to stitch down that line, and then we will trim it with the 1/4 inch seam allowance and press it open. Then I'm also going to take the strip with the silver, and we're going to sew it to the 1.5 by 8.5 strip. Now you can see where I trimmed that off, and they overlap right down there at that corner when you press it open. Now I'm going to take and fold the block in half and give it a little finger press, and I'm going to do the same thing with the silver or the gray. And I like to do that to make sure that everything is centered. I'm going to line up those finger creases and give it a pin. Then I'm also going to take the 2.5 by 8.5, and I'm going to pin that toward the bottom of the block, and then I will press it toward the white pieces. Now to finish off this block, all we got to do is attach our 2.5 by 12.5 down each side. So there is the finished block. I'm going to turn mine into a pillow, but you can add it to your quilt top if you want a bigger quilt. So now let's get started on the second block. This block is fairly easy. You take and you cut a pattern piece at 8.5 square. The only thing we're going to do now is we're going to bring it in. We're going to take our 4 pieces that are 2.5 square. We're going to draw a line and do the snowball effect. You just draw a line from corner to corner on all 4 pieces. You're going to sew them on each corner on that line. You're also going to take your silver with your 1.5 by 3.5 and sew on each side of that gray or silver, whatever you're using for your ornament top. Now we're just going to take our ruler and leave that 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to line up my 1/4 inch on the sewn line and then just trim. I don't throw away the triangles. So let me know below in the comments below, when do you start decorating for the holidays? I'm going to take this to the iron and press these open and press these toward the gray. What we're going to do is take the 1.5 by 8.5 and attach to there, and the 2.5 by 8.5 and attach it to the bottom. So yeah, when do you start to decorate for the holidays? Outdoors will start any day now with it still being somewhat nice, but for putting up our Christmas tree and the decorations inside, we do not start until Thanksgiving Day. I know some people like to put up earlier. My daughter already has her tree up. So when do you start decorating? Let us know. I'm going to just take this to the sewing machine and press toward the white when I'm done. And we'll be back to finish up this block. Now what I'm going to do is take and fold the gray in half and give it a little finger press just to find the center. Then I'm going to do the same thing with this ornament block. And this way I'm just making sure I have it center, the hook is centered with my ornament. And I'm going to sew this down 1/4 inch, then we'll press it open to the white. Don't she look so cute laying there protecting my scrap fabric. Now let's finish this block by sewing on our 2.5 by 12.5 inch strips to each. Okay, so if you're making the same size that I am, you're going to need about 1 yard of fabric for your sashing. If you're going to make it bigger with 20 blocks, you're going to need about 1.5 yards. You're going to cut it 2.5 inches by 12.5 inches. Now I just cut mine the width of the fabric and then subcut it down into the pieces. Then you're going to take your leftover scraps that are at least 2.5 inches wide, and you're going to make 2.5 inch squares. You're going to need about 25 corner blocks, and you're going to need 40 sashing pieces. That is if you're doing the square 4x4 block that I am creating. So the first thing we got to do is lay out our blocks on how we want them laid out. So I've already pre-laid mine out so I know which order to put them in. So this is how I'm laying mine out. Next, what you want to do is lay out your corner blocks. And so I just kind of lay them out so whatever block I'm picking isn't touching one of the blocks, so like I don't have that fabric in that block. As close as I can. I understand there's going to be times that I can't be able to do that. So now what you're going to do is you're going to take your sashing. You're going to sew one to each left side of the block. So everyone will have one on the left side. The last one you're going to sew on both sides. And because I'm doing the strip piecing, that's why I'm laying it out this way. Then you're going to also sew a sashing between each of those corner blocks, or a corner block to each end. So I just start by pinning everything together. So I'm going to take the blocks and pin to the left side of the sashing. So I want to make sure that my corner blocks are going the right direction. You want them facing up. And then I'm just laying them one on top of each other, so I know which order that they go in. Then on the last sashing for this strip, we're going to pin one corner block on each end. And now we're going to do the same thing for our blocks. So what you could do is you can take your sashing and stitch it onto each block on the left hand side. Then you can take and sew a corner block to the left side of the other ones and stitch all of those before you lay it out. If you want to, you know, do the whole quilt all at one time, I'm doing it as row per row. So then that way I can stitch them on different directions to make sure that it don't give the wave, get a wave in it, so it all stays straight. But that's another option. So we're just going to go and chain stitch these till they're all are stitched down. And then I'm going to press them all to the sashing. That way, when we go to put everything together with this row and the previous row, it's all going to line up and match. It's going to be nestled together. So let's sew these together. So I have them pressed to the sashing, and I'm just going to lay them back out so I can be able to stitch them all together. And the next step, I'm just going to stitch the whole row together. So I'm going to take the last piece of the strips and pin them together, and just pin it so you have one long strip, so then you can just be able to go in and sew them all together and press toward the sashing once again. So here's the block 3 and 4 of this row. I'm just putting 3 pins in. Then I'm going to open it up and attach number 2 to number 3, and so forth. I just like to be able to just keep running through the sewing machine and not have to stop so many times. I can just trim the thread, flip it around, and go. I'll bring you guys back once I have it sewn together and pressed. So this is how I like or do my stitching when I'm piecing the blocks together, so I don't waste so much thread. I'm going to stitch this first block down. I'm going to put my needle down and leave that in my sewing machine. Now I'm going to grab the strip and I'm going to sew that. Bring the needle down. Now I'm going to snip this thread, leaving the strip in my sewing machine. And now I'm going to sew the next set of blocks together. I'm going to leave the needle down, grab the sashing, the long strip, snip it, leaving the blocks in my sewing machine and move on to the next grouping. I'm going to continue this until I have it all sewn together. I like doing it this way because now the only piece I had to cut and leave a tail is at the last piece here, and now it's all sewn together without any waste of thread on each section. Now what we got to do is sew the strip onto our blocks, and to do that you're just going to nestle the seams up and pin them. I pin on each seam and then one in the center. So our corner blocks are going to line up with the sashing. So I just nest them seams and pin it and then put one in the middle of the block. It helps keep it all together. Once we have it all pinned, we're going to sew it on, and then I'm going to just open it up and do the same thing and pin it to this other row, and then we'll iron it toward the sashing as well. So here is one section and our second section. They are both 2 blocks long and 4 blocks wide. And now we're going to sew these 2 blocks or sections together, and that will give us almost the finished quilt top. So let's pin and sew these and press toward the sashing. Well, there is our quilt top for the most part. We have one more strip we have to make. So you need to make a total of 5 of your sashing strips. So we need to make one more to go along the bottom of our quilt top, and then it will be finished and ready to quilt and bind as desired. So once again, I'm just taking my squares and laying them out, and then we're going to take and do like we did before. We're going to take our sashing and pin a corner square onto the left side of the sashing. You're going to stitch them together just like we did before, and then we're going to attach it to our quilt top, and then our quilt will be done. So while I finish this up, why don't you comment below and let me know how you would go about quilting it. Would you do a straight quilting like in the ditch, or would you do a free motion? And if you chose a free motion, what design would you do? Meander or a Christmas theme one? So comment below and let me know while I finish sewing these together and sewing it onto our quilt block. And there is our finished quilt top, ready to go get quilted and binded so I can put it on the back of my couch for the holidays. It measures 58 by 58. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see how each block was made, there's going to be a playlist popping up probably right up here. And if you want to see some more quilts being made, there's another playlist right here of full tutorials on the different quilts that I have been making. So until then, happy quilting, my friends.